Joining us. My name is Ryan Martin. I'm the Deputy Director of the NGA Center for Best Practices. Welcome to our webinar today on mitigating artificial intelligence risks in state government. As we all know, artificial intelligence and lately generative AI is a hot topic and one that we know every state is grappling with, looking at what it can do, how it can be used, and in particular risks that may arise in deploying it. And so today our goal is to provide state leaders with an introduction to major categories of AI risk when applied in state government setting, as well as approaches that you can take to address it. We'll hear from national experts and state leaders on the types of risks posed by AI applications, as well as learn about promising practices to ensure their responsible use in the public sector. And we're focused on all kinds of AI, not just generative AI, so I wanted to point that out. Just a quick overview of NGA, which you should all be familiar with, but we're an association of governors of 55 states and territories, and our focus is really on helping them achieve their goals. And the Center for Best Practices does that in a few ways. We have about 50 policy staff that help governors and their state leaders by facilitating the exchange of ideas between states. We help them identify and share best practices, and we help states develop actionable policy. And with the focus on real applied policy, I want to highlight a few recent polls about AI to identify what the public is thinking about it, given there's a fair amount of concern. And so we're excited to have some discussions about ways to address that today. So Gallup organization in September did a poll and found that nearly 40% of people believe AI does more harm than good. And 4 out of 5 Americans have little trust in businesses' use of AI and their ability to use it responsibly. The MITRE Corporation did a poll through Harris in September and found that 39% of Americans believe AI is safe and secure, down from 48% who agree with that in November 2022, which was right before GPT-3, I guess ChatGPT, was launched at the very, very end of November last year. And similarly, the percentage of Americans who felt AI is advanced enough for use in defense applications declined 8 points. And support for consumer protections has grown significantly by 3 points since then as well, to up to 85%. So lots of interest in looking at the risks and addressing what those are. A couple other highlights I'll mention before turning it over to Kate with AAAS. And so Axios did a survey back in September that found, many Americans believe a new federal agency should be created to oversee the risks and regulate AI. Pew also did a survey late in August that found that over half of Americans are more concerned than excited about the use of AI. So timely topic. We know everyone here is grappling with this issue. Lots of promise and opportunity to augment staff that you have to make a real difference and streamline work and to improve services for your citizens, but also risks that need to be managed as well. So given that, we're glad that we can host this event today and talk about the risks and ways states can manage those. And I'll turn it over to Kate Stoll with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who's the project director at the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues. Kate.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so all of that adds up to an acronym, the AAAS EPI Center. Lots of words in there. So our mission is to build trusted relationships between experts and decision makers at all levels of government to make it easier for policymakers to access and incorporate scientific evidence into their decision-making processes. And as Ryan said, we're part of AAAS, the largest multidisciplinary society. And we're really excited to collaborate with NGA for this event. I just want to make a quick note that this event is being recorded and it will be posted on the NGA website. And we have a packed agenda for you today, so just go through it very quickly before I introduce our first speaker. So in this session, we're going to address what are the major categories of risk that AI can pose when used by state governments, and what are some of the evidence-based approaches to mitigating those risks. And we're happy to feature 3 state leaders who are going to talk about AI risk mitigation policies in their states. And of course, we'll end it with an open Q&A. So get your questions ready. And we'll have you raise your hand at the end of that so that you can unmute yourself and ask your question live. Also want to point out that Sally Root of NGA has created an outstanding AI policy resources document. So we'll make sure you get that in a follow-up email to this webinar. And with that, let's jump right in. And I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker today. Alexandra Givens is the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization fighting to protect civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. And since I can't put it in the chat, It's easy to find her bio online if you want to learn more about her history. And she's going to give us a quick overview of the types of risk posed by AI and evidence-informed risk mitigation approaches. So Ms. Givens, thank you for being here today, and I'll ask you to take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today, and it really is an honor to join this group. I'm going to share my screen, which I will set up right now, and we can jump right into it. So, as was teed up, CDT is a nonpartisan organization. Is a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm dialing you from right now. And we advise government agencies as well as companies on responsible design and deployment practices. Today, I'm going to talk briefly about the types of risks that we are most focused on in this space, based on the evidence that has been collected and incidents that we've seen over the past number of years. Touch briefly on the growing consensus we are seeing around elements of trustworthy AI, and then get really specific about concrete steps that executive agencies can take right now, both around the government's own use of AI, where I'll spend most of my time, and then responding to harmful uses of AI out in the world as well. So what types of risks to talk about? There is a risk that the current news cycle really is focused on future AI harms and risks of extinction. Those of you who are hearing about AI and talking about it at the Thanksgiving table and elsewhere will have been hearing these headlines, which are a crucially important conversation, but often can distract from the very real ways in which AI is impacting people's rights and access to economic opportunity and effective government services today. So today, when I am talking about types of AI harms, I am looking more at this set of issues presented right here in the slide. I should have a little note here. I'm happy to share these slides after. They are quite text heavy. That should not feel overwhelming. It's just in case people want to reference this as a resource later. So talking about some of the issues on this slide, we are seeing the increasing use of AI for security and surveillance purposes, the use by law enforcement in facial recognition and predictive policing. The use in the administration of public benefits program has also raised concerns. And then private sector uses that are having a significant impact on our information environment. I'm going to briefly touch on a couple of these to give a little bit more detail, while then fast tracking on to some of the approaches that governments are able to take. So example one that is worth spending a couple of minutes on is the growing use of AI in public benefit systems. This isn't new. We've actually seen increasing use of automated decision systems over the past 10 to 15 years. And in multiple cases, we have seen instances of systems that were poorly developed or poorly designed, often by contractors and vendors, being implemented in a way that significantly impacts citizens' rights and access to economic opportunity and basic government services. And in multiple instances, have also exposed government agencies to litigation. So, for example, a system adopted to detect fraud in unemployment insurance programs seems to have wrongly accused between 20,000 and 40,000 citizens of employment insurance fraud, basically by having miscorrelations between the data sets. So misidentifying whether people were currently employed or not at the time that they applied for benefits. Those were errors in database linkage, for example, causing those harms. In some cases, we have seen that the systems were so fully automated that if you had a red flag accusing you of fraud in that system, it automatically led to notices being sent and then punitive measures if people did not sufficiently respond in time. So we saw people having their benefits canceled, charged fines of as much as $100,000, as alleged in one case, pushing people into bankruptcy. A state review in one example of this showed that during the time the system was used, 93% of the accusations of fraud were wrong. As many of you know, we have also seen instances of AI going wrong in the criminal justice system. Some of you may be familiar with the Pulitzer Prize nominated article published by ProPublica in 2016 called Machine Bias, that was looking at the use of AI in the criminal justice system to make decisions about bail, and also about parole decisions. We've seen instances of face recognition leading to wrongful arrests. In one instance in Georgia, a man was imprisoned for 6 days, was jailed for 6 days as a result of a wrong facial recognition match. This is leading to litigation exposure. It is leading to outrage from constituents, again, because of concerns about the adequacy of the tools and the appropriateness of their use. We've also seen instances in other contexts, so the use of AI in hiring or workplace decisions, so deciding who gets a job, who's advanced, as well as questions around the use of the housing market, credit, and insurance. We can talk more about those use cases in the discussion if it's helpful. But one of the things that we are seeing, in addition to policymakers raising increasing awareness around AI, is increasing convergence about what good looks like and what are the elements of trustworthy AI that government officials and regular citizens should insist upon when these tools are being used in a way that significantly impacts people's rights. Two documents are particularly worthy of note here. One is the Biden administration's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which spelled out 5 rights that people should expect of systems to be working well, safely, and effectively. A very similar notion is embodied in NIST's AI risk management framework, which I understand many of you will be familiar with and may have talked about before, which posits elements such as these systems should be valid and reliable. They should be well tested. They should be secure and resilient, so protect people's privacy and data security, elements of transparency and accountability in how these systems work, explainability, and making sure that they do not have a disparate impact or inherent bias within them. So the question is, how should executive agencies implement this in practice as you think about government use of AI? Importantly, there is a crucial role for the states here, and it's really important for states to ensure that their own systems are working responsibly and well. We're seeing good movement in ideas on how to do this, coming both from the federal government and a number of states, including many profiled on the panel that's going to come, about concrete ways to start operationalizing this in practice. For me, one of the key elements is how we move from lofty ideals, great AI systems shouldn't discriminate, to how governments and individual decision makers actually operationalize that in practice. And so the goal in all of this is to set out those values, but also give guidance on how to meaningfully achieve them in a way the government staff can actually follow through on. One good model of how to do this is in current guidance that is being issued by the Office of Management and Budget. It's out for review now on federal government agency use of AI. For those of you who aren't familiar with this document, I strongly urge you to look at it as a template and see which aspects work for you. And I'm going to briefly highlight some of the key elements that I find particularly valuable here as something to kickstart discussion. So one of the key elements of this guidance is about mandating risk management practices for any government agency or individual who is considering deploying or developing an AI tool. These can include some very kind of basic steps. So number one, determining if an AI system impacts people's rights or people's safety. If it does, require minimum practices. So they have to complete an AI impact assessment, thinking about what the impact of that system is going to be on people's rights or safety, making sure they're looking at that in a comprehensive way. Testing performance in a real-world context, evaluating the AI, doing that not only at the time of design, but in an ongoing monitoring framework as well. And then ensuring adequate human training so that people know how to do this testing. The OMB guidance also then goes a different direction, or adding another layer for practices for AI uses that significantly impact people's rights. So here we need to add on the lens to make sure that AI systems are tested for equity and non-discrimination, and have an element of consulting impacted groups around what unintended consequences or applications of this system might be. These aren't just nice to have. These are steps that can ensure the government is avoiding liability as well. So in this earlier slide where I talked about some public benefits cases that have led to significant litigation against government agencies, the causes of action there often have sat on government agencies violating their constituents' due process rights or APA obligations by deploying a tool that significantly impacts people's rights without appropriate public notice and consideration, or in a manner that is inconsistent, of poor quality, or doesn't allow people an opportunity for meaningful notice and review. So these elements of risk management practices are important to get them right in the first place, but also are really important from a legal risk management perspective as well. A second key element of responsible AI deployment is not just mandating these risk management practices, but thinking about accountability through reporting and documentation. One mode that we've seen in Vermont, as well as in the OMB guidance, and some other states are considering this too, is directing agencies to inventory their uses of AI, designate whether or not they impact people's rights and safety, and issuing templates for reporting in those high-risk use cases so that there becomes a centralized repository where you can have a handle on what agencies' AI uses look like, and the public can have understanding and access as well. A third step, of course, is designating appropriate staff who can help manage this work and equipping those staff for success. In the OMB guidance at the federal level, they are planning to mandate that all agencies have a chief AI officer. That can be someone who is dual-hatted, not new hires, so it can be the chief data officer or the chief privacy officer who also holds this responsibility, but who has that central role and a central point of accountability to surface best practices. We need to think about ways to provide teams with relevant expertise, and then, of course, guidance and templates, working groups, and other mechanisms that can help provide support for this. And hopefully we'll talk more about this in the panel. A fourth area that I'll flag for you, and a final one in this kind of ways in which you can take concrete action on the government use of AI, is taking specific steps on procurement. The reason to pause here is that, of course, the procurement process is a really instrumental moment in shaping future AI uses, and it's the time when you really are able to ask those questions and make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly and well. Here, again, we need increased resources and expertise for the individuals who are managing a procurement process to be able to test systems that are being surfaced by vendors, know what questions to ask, know what good looks like. And there are important elements to put into this process too, like ensuring that the government retains appropriate control and ownership over the model, over the data that might be being organized or used as an improvement as part of the adoption of the AI system. And of course, that you have sufficient visibility, access, and transparency into the system to be able to meet those due process obligations and also just the measures of effective governance. Okay, so those are 4 steps around the government use of AI. I'm going to briefly touch on countering harmful AI uses. And the reason I want to double click here is that I think it's essential that in your programs, you think comprehensively, not only about how the government is leading by example, but the concrete steps the executive branch can take now to address ways in which AI is impacting people's rights and our information environment. One area that is important to talk about is the role of government officials in providing authoritative information at a time when generative AI is making it easier than ever for there to be deepfakes, manipulated information, and to undermine user trust in the information environment. Time for a good meme and a good image. Many of you will be familiar with Balenciaga Pope. The image on the left is not a realistic depiction of the Pope wearing a fancy puffer jacket. But what I point here on this slide is that this is not an information crisis. An image of a false image of an attack on the Pentagon can be an information crisis. This happened earlier this year. It was quickly and effectively rebutted, which is good. But we need to think about other ways, and you specifically as government agencies need to think about ways in which you can pre-bunk, debunk mistaken and misleading information among your population. This, of course, comes up in the context of elections. We have seen this already happen in around misrepresentations about British political speakers. In the recent Argentinian elections, there were deepfakes. Information about access to polling locations is something that people are talking a lot about. But we're also seeing it come up increasingly in extortion scams and consumer fraud scams. So people creating fake audio of a loved one's voice, playing it to their relative, and using it to extract financial money from them. Right now, law enforcement is not well equipped to respond to those. And so that is a critical area where you can be responsive and helpful right now. So government officials must act to protect their role as trusted sources of civic information. And there are concrete steps that you can do around that. Thinking about your branding, the trust indicators that help people know when to rely on your information. For example, using .gov domains for official releases of information, making sure that you are thinking about those markers and indicia of truth. proactive messaging and pre-bunking false narratives, and then creating established channels for communication, for example, so that reporters know who to call to get that immediate gut check when there is a fake image of an attack in your state, for example, how you are going to quickly respond to that in real time. And then the second counter, or kind of second point to keep in mind, is to take AI-driven harm seriously. Here, I mention again that law enforcement needs to be equipped to address these concerns around consumer fraud or extortion. Non-consensual, intimate imagery, unfortunately, is being turbocharged by deepfakes and by generative AI. And law enforcement needs to take that seriously to truly serve your constituents and consumers. There are, many worry, critical infrastructure and cybersecurity risks that come from AI. And again, you'll need to think about those issues in your state and how your resiliency is set up for your own agencies. There's guidance that your agencies can give to the private sector around consumer protection issues, discrimination issues, civil rights, housing, employment considerations. And we've seen some states start to take action there. Any funds that your state is considering putting towards incentivizing AI innovation, that's a wonderful and creative use of state monies, but you need to make sure you're using that opportunity to push for responsible innovation as well. And then finally, advancing a strategic legislative agenda to see where there are gaps in the existing legislative landscape and taking steps to fill them. It's a very quick whistle stop, but I hope this gives you some concrete ideas that you might want to follow up on. And happy to talk more in the chat after we've heard about these state leaders who are doing a lot of this work in real time today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alex. And yes, we'll have time for questions after our panel, in which we can field questions from the audience for everyone. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Sally Rude, Senior Policy Analyst for NGA Center for Best Practices, to introduce our state panelists. Thanks, Sally.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon, good morning to those on the West Coast. The NGA Center is really delighted to be able to feature several state speakers on AI today. The first speaker, I'm going to present them in the order they'll be talking, and we aren't going to interrupt in between their presentations, but we will address questions, as Kate said, afterwards. Our first speaker is Katie Reckel, Chief Privacy Officer for the state of Washington. She works with Washington Tech Solutions and all of the state agencies actually on privacy issues. Our second speaker is Andrew Wheeler, Director of Regulatory Management for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And our third speaker is intended to be Josiah Rage, and Josiah is not on our call at the moment, but I'm going to introduce him in hopes that he's able to join us in time. He's the Director of Artificial Intelligence for the Vermont Agency of Digital Services. So Katie, you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure, and I think Abby is going to be running the slides. Yep, thank you. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm on the West Coast. So I'm Katie Ruckel. I'm the state's Chief Privacy Officer in the state of Washington. I always have to say state of Washington when I am in Washington, D.C. And part of my position as privacy officer is to articulate privacy principles, look at projects that involve personally identifiable information, and then, of course, work closely with cybersecurity and data protection. I mention these because these are all parts of my position that has led me into working on a lot of the artificial intelligence initiatives and conversations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of my work in with the automated decision systems work group, and then the generative AI guidelines that we created. So next slide. I have the pleasure of being a co-chair with Nick Stowe, our state chief technology officer, who I believe presented to this community last last month or the month before. So we are co-chairs of the Artificial Intelligence Community of Practice in Washington. And as a part of that work, we have subcommittees and a steering committee. Our subcommittees right now include a subcommittee on risks and evaluating AI risks and use cases for state agencies, as well as a focus of local government. So it is comprised of local government agencies as well as the state agencies. So part of the risks, if we can go to the next slide, and thank you so much from Alexandra. She covered a lot of the information, and I have 23 slides. I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but my slides will also be available to you. But part of the challenge is more data is needed to build AI, train AI, and maintain AI. And so with all of this additional data that is needed to work in these foundational models, it leads to a lot of risks, especially when we think about it in the privacy context. So if you look at the next slide, I highlight a few of the risks that we've already seen in terms of the amount of data needed for foundational models. So some of the risks include data persistence, which means we're keeping data much longer than we need to. A lot of our legacy systems, especially in government, were built to collect and store data, but not necessarily delete data. And so that can lead to privacy risks. Data repurposing, which is collecting data for one purpose and then reusing it for another. Data spillovers, which is sort of the over collection of data when especially you see this with some of the law enforcement tools like the Stingray that has targeted cell phone use that it's trying to collect, but it collects a lot of other people's cell phone data at the same time. Data commingling is another risk because where we're combining lots of different types of data and maybe able to make inferences in unexpected ways, which also I think ties into some of the data repurposing challenges. And then data integrity is another risk that we've already seen talked about quite frequently in the media in terms of the accuracy of the information coming out of these large language models, including false information and hallucinations. So part of the way I've talked about addressing these risks in the state of Washington is through our privacy principles. And these are not new. These are all have been around since the FIPS, Fair Information Practice Principles, in the 70s. However, I think in terms of looking at these risks with the amount of data that's going to be collected, it's nice to know that we have ways to address or think about mitigating some of these risks. So if you think about data minimization as I'm sorry, if you keep clicking, there's some animation for the circles to show up. So the data minimization, I think, helps address some of the data persistence risks. Data purpose limitation helps to address the data repurposing risks. I think lawful, fair, and responsible use helps to mitigate against some of the data commingling and data spillover considerations that I mentioned in terms of law enforcement collection of data. And then, of course, data transparency and accountability is something that can be used to address many of these risks in terms of being transparent about the type of data you're collecting and stating the purpose you're collecting it, and then being held accountable to those purposes. And then when possible, and I know this is challenging for government agencies, but when possible, I try to always encourage that you have individual participation, which is allowing people to opt in and understand a little bit more about how their data is being collected and used. And I know for many of our government programs, we're required to collect and keep personal information for a very long time, but I still like to highlight this where possible to give people as much control and rights over their data. So I won't say that security and due diligence are not important principles, but in terms of tying to the immediate risk of data, those are the ones that I wanted to highlight. So the next slide, I quickly go over what our guidelines are in the state of Washington in terms of how the document is structured, but I'm going to specifically talk about our principles, guidelines, and the do's and don'ts over the next couple of slides. So Alexandra did a great presentation of the NIST AI risk framework in terms of many of the considerations that came out of the blueprint, the White House blueprint on use of AI. And so I won't spend a lot of time going into each of these principles. They are very well explained, I think, in the NIST AI risk framework, but they are foundational for the state of Washington in terms of the guidelines that we're giving to state agencies. The one principle on here that I do want to highlight that is not part of the NIST AI risk framework, although I think its concept is incorporated. We specifically called out in the Washington state guidelines the public purpose and benefit principle in terms of thinking about how the use of AI should support the state's work in delivering better and more equitable services and outcomes to its residents. So I'm going to quickly talk about some of the actual guidelines that we're recommending to state agencies. So the first guideline is fact-checking, bias reduction, and review, which this is really, most of these guidelines are geared toward, I think, state agency employees and local government employees using the public models. So the public large language models that we already know are available, like ChatGPT and Bard and a few others. And so we're expecting that they're using these tools. And so we wanted to put out expectations we have in terms of the content that they may be generating when they are creating a state work product. And so these are all expectations that we have in terms of how state agencies should be using the information and being more aware that some of the training data that may be in these algorithms could possibly reflect biases. And so if you are creating that content, doing your best to review for those biases. And another piece of that, we're expecting to give more guidance on this, I think, coming down the line, but we've been talking a lot about incorporating community feedback as well in terms of the use of the tools. The next slide is disclosure and attribution. So this really gets to being transparent about when you have created AI generated content and being clear about what your authorship was and how you're responsible for the content evaluation. And then also that goes into being accountable. A lot of the other, I think, concerns we've heard is in terms of copyrighted risks. And so that's another area where we've asked staff to have some awareness of those risks. The last area that I'm going to highlight here really gets into the risk of breaches or using sensitive or confidential data in public models. That is a no-no. And we've tried to make that very clear to our public employees. And then on the next slide, part of the reason we want to emphasize this is actually against our state's ethics law if you do breach confidential information and in an unethical manner, especially like this. And we have had pretty severe penalties in our state for breaching confidential information. One public employee who did that had to pay a fine of $50,000. So there's pretty high, I would say, risk in terms of inadvertently using confidential data in this way, putting it into public models. And so we're trying to heighten the awareness of our state workforce in terms of the use of this type of data in public models. And so you will see that that is very well highlighted in our state's do's and don'ts, but we're also trying to recognize and encourage, although we're talking about risks today, thinking about how you can use these types of tools to improve your work. And so if you go and look at some of the do's and don'ts, we do list a lot of ways in which we would encourage state agencies to be able to use these types of tools to perform their works, which is rewriting documents in plain language for better accessibility and understandability. And condensing longer documents into summarizing text so that but of course, the don't is don't include sensitive or confidential information when you're entering prompts into these systems. That's a theme. So the next slide talks about the drafting documents, which I just mentioned. The next slide talks about aid in coding. So this has been a hot topic, especially with our technical side of the workforce and developers and our security folks. And so we definitely are looking at tools like GitHub and being able to use that through Microsoft. And we have been very clear about being careful about how you may be using coding or putting coding into these systems, but also making sure that you're testing your codes and you're familiar with them so you're not accidentally incorporating any malicious code into systems. The next area is generating image and audio and video content for effective communication. So that gets into some of the other risks, though, in terms of making sure that you are creating accessible content as well as content that is not biased. And then frequently we've been hearing about the use of these tools to create chatbots based on your website. So the piece that we try to engage agencies on is making sure that the chatbots are being trained on public data and not being does not put any risk of resident data. And then also ensuring that people understand when they're interacting with a chatbot or AI, but then also being able to reach a human for assistance. So the next slide just talks about some of the use cases we've already tackled in the state of Washington. And I know Nick Stowe, the Chief Technology Officer, spoke to this group about that. But we use it for monitoring and reviewing hours and hours of footage of seagrass in the state of Washington. We are using AI for smoke detection in remote areas of the state for wildfire mitigation. It's being used for cybersecurity reasons, chatbots, and then some of the natural language processing is another area we're starting to look at in terms of use of these types of tools. So the other data and privacy considerations that I am trying to help build awareness in the workforce especially is thinking about where the training data came from, was it legally obtained, and then having especially being sensitive to whether or not data is being used as a proxy for something else. For example, we know zip codes can sometimes be used as a proxy for race. And so those are areas that we want to help encourage the workforce to be very thoughtful and mindful in terms of how they may be collecting and using and sharing data to create these foundational models. So I mentioned that the state of Washington has been having these conversations for a few years, going back to 2021, where Senator Hasagawa in our state has introduced several bills to regulate the use of automated decision systems. And Alexandra talked a lot about some of the risks that come from that. And so as a part of that work, if you go to the next slide, we created a work group called the Automated Decision Systems at the time, automated decision-making systems work group, and we actually issued a report, which had 7 recommendations, and the report is online, and I have a link in the slide for those that want to access it. But a lot of the recommendations get to some of the mitigation pieces that we've already talked about, which is there's limited resources to evaluate every single use of automation. And so we would want to focus on those areas that have the most impact on to people's rights and freedoms. We are issuing procurement guidelines. We also want to evaluate existing systems in terms of ADS and are working on creating an inventory of our ADS, which of course leads to transparency and giving notice to the public in terms of when these systems are in use. We did have a conversation about whether or not some systems or uses may be at such a high level or at such a risky level that they would be prohibited. And that gets into some of I think if you look at the EU AI model in terms of regulation there, they have an unacceptable risk level. And then we wanted to encourage ongoing monitoring and auditing of systems, especially if we're making changes to the algorithms that impact individuals. And then bottom line, we also want to make sure our workforce has training in the risk of automation bias, and then also in the training in the use of these tools. So those came out of our report in 2021, but are themes in terms of how we should be addressing risk for artificial intelligence and generative AI more generally. So that's everything that I have for today. I'm happy to take questions, I think when we have time for Q&A, but I'm also available to contact via email. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie. We'll turn straight to Director Wheeler.
Thank you. And I want to thank NGA for inviting me to participate today. So I'm not using a slide deck, and I'll try to, I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'll try to keep within my 8 to 10 minutes where we have some time for questions. First of all, we all need to remember that AI has been around since the 1950s in one form or another. Agencies, federal government agencies, state agencies, probably every single state has been using some form of AI for a number of years. Governor Youngkin, we started looking at this issue in depth this year, wanted to make sure that we put some guardrails in place to safeguard people's information, PPI, as well as discouraging the misuse of AI, while also encouraging and its use and trying to figure out how it can be used to make government more efficient and transparent. So he issued an executive directive on September 20th. I believe we were the 3rd state after Kansas and California to issue a governor's directive or order addressing AI. And the way he approached AI and the way we've approached it is to call for a set of standards, 3 different reports, and then to take a look at some potential pilot projects where we could test out the standards moving forward. We've created a number of different work groups here in the Commonwealth to create the standards, and our deadline to brief the governor is December 15th. And actually, we're briefing him on December 14th, where we are presenting him draft final standards. Now, the 4 sets of standards. The first is on legal questions. Right now, the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth, does not have any specific statutes or legal requirements on AI, although existing government statutes and regulations dealing with procurement and IT do apply. So the first set is to take a look at what are the legal requirements for the purchasing and use of AI products, development of systems, etc. The second is more traditional on the IT side. And our set of standards here is developed by our IT department. And this takes a look at things such as firewalls and other IT questions for the use of AI and developing AI products and programs. The third is on the policy side. And this is a little unique. We actually divided out the policy from the IT Historically, we've always combined policy questions in our IT standards, as we did last year when we issued cybersecurity standards. The policy issues were embedded in the IT cybersecurity standards. We separated out the policy issues because of the general concern that so many people have about the use and potential misuse of AI. We wanted to make sure that those policy issues were highlighted and given prominence. And when I'm talking about policy issues, specifically the approval process, who within state government has the authority to approve the use of an AI project or program. I'll just pause here for a second. Under our state processes, agencies right now for an IT project can spend up to $250,000 on an IT project without going to our state IT agency for approval. For AI projects, we're going to put a $0 threshold. We want to make sure that there is oversight over all AI projects going forward. The second is disclaimers. What are the important disclaimers that you should put on an AI product, such as whether or not it was reviewed, to what level of review the information had, etc. Third is mitigating third-party risks, and then finally protecting citizens' data. So those are the policy issues that we are highlighting in our policy standards. The fourth set of standards, and this is why they're actually standards / guidelines, is because I can't call these standards, they're guidelines. They're education guidelines for K through 12. For those of you who work in the education field, you know that standards has a very specific definition under the education umbrella. So these are education guidelines for K through 12 on how we recommend AI is used and what we believe should be used to safeguard students, make sure that they are learning about AI without using it as a means to, for lack of a better word, to cheat. But to make sure that they're being taught AI and that they're being prepared for careers of the future. In addition to the 4 sets of standards and guidelines, we have 3 reports that are also due to the governor next week. The first is on education, and it looks not just at K through 12, but post-secondary, and it looks more at the curriculum. What is the curriculum that's needed from kindergarten all the way through postgraduate? What are the courses that should be recommended? What do we need to make sure that our students are prepared for careers of the future, whether they are specifically in AI technology careers or any other career, because every career eventually will touch more on AI. So we want to make sure that our students are prepared for the jobs and careers of the future. The second report is from our Department of Economic Development, and it's to take a look at, one, how we can attract more AI companies into Virginia. We already, with our national defense concentration here in Virginia, we have a lot of AI companies here, but what does the future look like for that sector? Also, how can we use AI to better attract and manage and figure out what businesses and what industries we should be reaching out to? So it's both trying to attract AI companies into Virginia, as well as using AI as a tool to help us in business development. And then the third report, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but Virginia has the largest concentration of data centers in the world. The data centers, as they are moving more and more into AI, will need to use more electricity. So what is the impact on the state of Virginia? What is the impact on our energy generation needs, demand, as the country and the world moves more towards AI? And then finally, we're also to present the governor a list of pilot projects. And what we've done here, first of all, is I divide AI pilots into 2 categories: internal and external. Internal pilots or projects are those projects that are used to make government act more effectively or efficiently. They're not designed for public interfacing. Although under our FOIA laws, the public could always get access to any of the information, but the purpose is not for a public facing or public interfacing project or program. It's to help a state agency, state government operate more effectively and efficiently. And a perfect example here, and one that we are looking at adopting, is our housing department, our building codes. This is we're probably not unique to any of the other states or commonwealths on this call, but we have in our building codes 7,000 pages of building codes. Now that may sound like a lot, but it's even worse, because we also incorporate by reference different national standards and other organizations' standards, and we end up by incorporating those documents with 700,000 pages of building codes. And again, I doubt that we're unique there, but I will tell you that our housing office can't tell you how many regulatory requirements are in the 700,000 pages. And while they don't think there are overlap or contradictions, nobody is certain. And if our staff sat down and tried to go through the 700,000 pages, it would literally take not months, but years to go through all of them. So we're looking to see if we could use AI, and we're looking with a couple of the universities here on some projects where we might be able to use AI to decipher the building codes and make some recommendations as to how those could be streamlined or be more effective. The other type of pilots are external. And those are, think of the chatbots. This is a public interfacing where we're trying to provide services to the public in a more efficient and an effective manner, where people can get access to the government services that they need and can help them with decision-making questions and problems. So we are presenting to the governor a list, first of all, a list of all of the ongoing AI projects. And there are actually more than I realized when we started this effort. And I'm sure that there are more, in effect, a lot of your all's agencies and departments than you realize as well. So we've created a list of all of the ongoing AI efforts across the state government. And then we've solicited ideas from our agencies, as well as some external ideas on what would make a good AI pilot or project. And from this list, the ideal here is to present to the governor, first of all, the standards that he would hopefully be comfortable with, and issue an executive order codifying those standards. And then we would launch, in my mind, maybe 3 to 5 different AI pilots next year in order to basically test the standards and see how they work and operate. We might have to go back and modify the standards. But the important thing in Governor Youngkin's mind is that we need to get some standards in place, get some guardrails up to protect the public as we move forward, to see how we can use AI to make government more efficient and effective. And then one last note on legislation versus executive action. AI, again, as I started my remarks, AI has already been around since the 1950s, and it is here, and it is in probably a lot more areas of your state agencies and departments than you realize. The important thing in our mind is to put some guardrails in place as quickly as possible before AI expands even faster. And I'm reminded back in 1996, I was working in the US Senate, and I worked on the 96 telecom bill that deregulated the telecom industry. It took 10 years for Congress to pass the 96 telecom bill. That legislation, while it was a landmark piece of legislation for anybody in the IT telecom space, you know what I'm talking about, that bill had a shelf life of less than 10 years. It was out of date before 2006. So I think it's important that we act, we move forward quickly to safeguard PPI information and to protect our citizens while we look to see how we can use and utilize AI in a effective, meaningful, but protective way. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wheeler. Great. So I really encourage everyone here, go to the 3 dots at the bottom of your Zoom that say more, click on that, and then go up to reactions and use the raise hand feature. That way we'll know who wants to ask a question first? So I'll give folks a few seconds to raise their hands to ask all of our excellent speakers today more about their expertise. And if nobody is gonna pop up, I can ask some questions, but I would definitely prefer to answer audience questions if possible. There we go. Asma Keeler, please come off mute. We are not hearing you. It's kind of,
Can you hear me now?
yes, there we go. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for a great presentation. Definitely a lot of really useful information. As we're getting going on this work here in Colorado, I'm wondering, of all of the priorities and tactics that we've learned about today, if we're starting from scratch, where do you start? What's the number one thing that we should be focusing on bringing to Gov on our end as we get going in this work?
I would say first figure out what you're already doing. Because as I said, I bet a lot of your agencies have already implemented different AI products or processes. And then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of draft standards, draft guidelines out there. Take a look to see what suits you. We took a hard look at our approval process to see how we could modify our approval process without creating new bureaucratic hurdles. But I would first start by seeing what your agencies have already done and how they did it. How did they get it approved? How effective have the projects been?
I'll just echo that. So in state of Washington, so the inventory of the AI use cases or where AI or automated decision systems are already being used. Part of the challenge I did have with that, though, is having agencies understand what you're asking for, because you don't want them to be reporting that their Excel spreadsheets are necessarily uses of AI. So it does get to what your definition is. So that's part of the things to think about when you're engaging your agencies.
One thing to think about is how you articulate the why. I think that's essential so that agencies don't view this as yet another compliance issue or just something that you're asking for paperwork purposes. But if you can get a clearly articulated statement of the types of harms that you're worried about and the behaviors you would like to see from agencies with respect to that, I think that value statement as a first step sends a signal to everyone we're watching and we're paying attention. Then it lets you go into the more detailed process of, okay, now let's get our arms around what's happening and do the inventorying. And then let's issue specific guidance and resources and rules of what we expect. But that values statement at the beginning can be really important just to hold the place and let people know this is a priority and why it's a priority as you then scramble to do the next pieces of the work.
Thank you. That's all really helpful.
Wonderful. Should we see if we have one more question before we close out? And while I'm waiting to see if there's another question, I'll just say that once you close out of this Zoom meeting, you'll be directed to a very short survey, just 4 questions that will really help us decide what are the next pressing topics that you all want to learn about with respect to AI. So really encourage you to just respond to that so we have a sense of what do you want to see next. Let's see. And then we will also follow up with this wonderful resource list that Sally Rood from NGA has compiled with resources like the NIST risk management framework, the various resources, some that Alex have mentioned, including some great examples from your peer states about how they're approaching AI risk management. Okay, so I'm not seeing a last question. Well, okay, so to respect everyone's time, we'll go ahead and close out, but we will also, if Abigail could please put up the last slide that has Sally and my and Ryan's email addresses. If you have any questions about AI or suggestions about what other materials you'd like to see in this space, we'd be very open to that. And because we want to make these webinars as salient as possible for your needs. I want to thank all of our speakers who did a fabulous job of presenting on what can be a very complicated topic and a very important topic. So we'll say thank you for everyone for participating, and we'll put up our emails at the end and follow up with an email as well. All right. Thank you, everyone. Stay in touch. Goodbye.